Hey, what's going on, guys? I'm going to talk to you today about the siege of Vicksburg, the other 4th of July. Now, I lived in Vicksburg for the first 18 years of my life, and I'm glad Vicksburg celebrates the 4th of July now. For the longest time, they didn't, and I'm glad that Vicksburg's part of the United States now. That they're not from a seceded Mississippi to that's its own country. I'm glad it's part of the USA, and I'm glad that they celebrate 4th of July. Get that out of the way, and I celebrate 4th of July. So. However, in the Civil War, and I'm glad the Union preserved Vicksburg. I'm glad they won that battle. I'm going to go ahead and get that out of the way, too. Even though I'm from the South, I'm glad the Union won. I'm glad the Mississippi flag has been changed. I'm just trying to report a historical event here. Okay. When the Civil War happened, or before the Civil War, when the South seceded, South Carolina was the first state to secede from the Union. Mississippi was the second. Now, there were a total of 99 delegates in Mississippi, and 84 of them voted to secede, 15 did not. Now, the delegates from Vicksburg voted against secession. They were a prosperous commercial city, and they traded a lot with the North, and they voted against secession. But back during that time, there was a lot more loyalty to your state than it was the federal government. And the patriotic fervor that the U.S. has, that really didn't start kicking off till about World War II or towards the end, or around World War II. So the people in Vicksburg didn't agree with secession, but many of them saw themselves as Mississippi first. Not all of them. There was a Mississippi Union regiment in the Civil War. About 545 white Mississippians sided with the Union during the Civil War. There were a lot more from a lot of other southern states as well. Every single southern state, but South Carolina was in a Union regiment. There were Virginia Union regiments, there were Florida Union regiments, North Carolina, Tennessee, Louisiana, Mississippi, and those weren't all Southern black regiments. There were plenty of Southern white regiments as well there, with the exception being South Carolina. Now, but the Vicksburg delegates voted against secession, okay? Now, we talked about that. But they saw themselves as Mississippians first. Well, Vicksburg was the closest city to the Mississippi River, or one of the closest city with economic value. So the Union knew that they had to take Vicksburg to be able to control the Mississippi River. And so, but there were Martin Luther Smith, who was originally from New York. He was born in Maine, but lived in New York most of his life. But he married a Southern woman. So he didn't want to divorce his wife. He fought for the South in the Civil War. He was the chief engineer that orchestrated the defense of Vicksburg, and he did a very good job. And Vicksburg is a very hilly town, and basically Union boats crossing the Mississippi River, attempting to cross it, even though they had a much larger navy than the Confederates, the Confederate artillery could just look down on them and shoot at those ships. And the Union had tried for several years to do that, and the Confederate artillery and Confederate landmines repelled most of them. But David Dixon Porter, a Union admiral from Pennsylvania, finally got past them. And General Grant said, speed your boats as fast as possible and get them across the Mississippi River. So because the Union had control of New Orleans at the time and some other cities in the South Louisiana. So they got past the Mississippi River and crossed the Mississippi River into Mississippi further down south where it wasn't as heavily defended. And they tried to take Vicksburg by force and not have to lay siege to keep the town suffering, but they failed to do so. Now, John Pemberton, who commanded the Confederate forces altogether, he was a Northerner by birth, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, but he married a Southern woman from Virginia, so he chose to fight for the South. He also had an ardent belief in states' rights, so when he was at West Point, he actually was on more friendly terms to the Southern cadets than a lot of Northern cadets. He moved his army from Vicksburg to try to take the Union forces away from Champion Hill, which was a key hill outside of Vicksburg, but his forces got routed anytime they tried to leave Vicksburg. The Union dug in a lot of good defensive perimeters, And so the Southern soldiers were basically stuck. They repelled Union advances into the city, but they couldn't repel Union trenches and Union defense perimeters outside the city. So for 47 days, General Grant ordered the siege of Vicksburg. And the General Pemberton had to cut the rations for his Confederate soldiers. They were down to 1 cup, just a handful of peas and rice per day, and like 1 small cup of water a day. So many of the soldiers were getting dehydrated. They were getting malnourished. And a lot of the civilian residents were eating rats, and sometimes eating their own horses, because that's all they could have. So the city, after 47 days, decided to surrender, and they actually surrendered on July 4th, 1863. And because of that, for the longest time, Vicksburg did not celebrate the 4th of July. They started to after they got behind the World War II effort like the rest of the country, and they believed in what their country was doing. And when they started hearing General Dwight Eisenhower speak, they started getting more thinking we need to celebrate 4th of July. So about in 1943, they started doing that again. But they started renaming it. They still had to name it Confederate Carnival, even though there were American flags there at the celebration and honoring the World War II soldiers. So really, when in 1976, America's bicentennial, which Vicksburg rallied behind and was happy about, they decided it was time to start celebrating the 4th of July completely again and not naming it Confederate Carnival. And the celebrations keep getting bigger and bigger. As long as when I was in Vicksburg the first 18 years of my life, there was big 4th of July celebrations. Families celebrated it, which I'm happy to see, and I was glad that it happened. So, I hope everybody's doing well. Take care. God bless them. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.